video series devoted to A Song of Ice and Fire wargame by Cool Mini or Not. We cover all aspects of the hobby with tactics and list build videos, painting tutorials of varying levels, and battle reports. In this video, we're going to be covering painting the House Umber Great Axes to a tabletop standard. The goal here is just to get them painted quickly, get them on the table so we can move on to the next unit. So I start priming these models with Vallejo polyurethane surface primer. There's a few different options out there for you if you're wanting to look into airbrushing your primer, and they really aren't all that different. The one that Scale 7.5 makes just comes out very matte, and the one from Badger, Steinelrez, it's comparable. As long as you get 2 coats like I'm doing here on the model, the primer should work fine. It's not going to be as protective as an enamel primer, but it'll get the job done if you're not whipping your models around. I'm going to do directional highlighting for the most prominent color on the Great Axes, and I've deemed that to be the leather from their armor. So we're starting out with charred brown from Vallejo Game Color, and I'm just covering a large portion of the model at a fairly low angle to get that base tone but leave some of the black primer behind to get some shadows going. In this shot, we're going in with Beastie Brown from Vallejo Game Color, and this is getting at a little bit higher of an angle from what we were doing before, and then we finish off with a top spray of Leather Brown from Vallejo Game Color. I'm just going to go back and reestablish that highlight. The next step I'm going to be doing is trying to marry the browns or blend the browns together, and the best way to do that is by utilizing some washes. I'm going to use Citadel or Games Workshop's Agrax Earthshade. I thinned it down with a bit of Liquitex Flow-Aid just to get it to move the way I want it to instead of being really saturated. When I hit these parts of the cape and the legs, I'm only leaving a small tint on the model. I'm not globbing the wash on there like you kind of normally would, but I still wouldn't recommend. All I want to do with those parts is just bring the colors together with that filter of Agrax Earthshade over it. When I get to the gloves and the boots, I'll leave some of the wash in those recesses just to get that shaded effect that you usually get with your washes. The last step I'll be doing with the leather brown is dry brushing with Vallejo Game Color Khaki. This is just to get that distressed leather look, making it look like this leather's been worked pretty hard. It's just a light dry brush. I'm not going over the top with this one. If you wanted to calm the brightness of it down, you could rewash with the Agrax Earthshade. Now that the leather is where I want it to be, we're going to come in and do the deepest parts of the model next, and we're going with the face being the deepest part of the model that's going to be painted here. I'm basing it with Citadel or GW Bugman's Glow. The GW foundation paints are probably the only ones that I'd regularly use outside of their washes. They just have a way of really blocking in color regardless of what's under them. If you were to take this over black, it'd probably take a couple coats, but it works out pretty well. Next, I'm going in with just picking out the edges of the facial features, the ones that stick out the most, being the cheekbones and the nose, and maybe a little bit of the lip here. The color I'm using to do this is P3 or Privateer Press's Cardic Flesh. This is a little bit of a step up from the Bugman's Glow, so these two work out really well when it comes to just creating a good transition without having to really blend them. They're just fairly close in color. I'm going to take the highlights on this model up just one more step, and to do that I'm using Scale 7.5 Fantasy line. The color's called Resurrection Flesh. This one is a little more, I guess, creamy or pink. I guess the color's just a little sharp from the Bugman's Glow to Cardic Flesh, but with trying to do this to be just decent looking on the table, I just want to get some of those highlights to stand out, just to actually be noticeable on the table. So I'm not looking for the greatest transition. A few steps here and there doesn't bother me. Next up on the face, we're going to work with the beard, and I know that it said that I wanted to work with the deepest portion of the model next. I figure I can just get the beard knocked out here, and I think for the top part of this model, this is the next deepest item that I'd be working on, just because that little drape of the cloak in the front of the model, that's gonna stay the way it is. It's not getting painted. For the black that I'm using is just Vallejo Game Color Black. Nothing fancy about it. To highlight the beard, I'm going to be mixing Vallejo Game Color Somber Gray or Shadow Gray with a little bit of the black that I had used earlier. The beard has some nice sculpted details on it, so I can pick those out just to show that there's some variation or highlight coming to the beard and the hair. This is a little stark, so if you wanted it to be more smooth, you could wash the beard down with like Mullen oil from GW, but I'm fine with this standing out a little much. Next I'm going in with the metal-based color, and for this I'm using some of that Vallejo Game Color Black mixed with Scale 7.5 Black Metal. The reason why I mix those two together, the black metal is a really dark metal, so it really could have been the base for this model, but I'm not going to go back and wash the metals once I'm finished, so I want the shadows to have a little bit of, or have some of the shine taken off of them. You can achieve that by mixing your metal with a non-metallic color. I'm giving the metals a little bit more time to dry by moving on to the red tabard that's on the model. And to get this House Umber red look that they have, I'm starting out with Tindalos red from Scale 7.5's Fantasy color line. This color goes on smooth and is packed with enough pigment to where it can cover up what's underneath it pretty well. If you're doing this over black or a really bright color, it'll take a couple passes, but nothing too intense. Red is one of those colors that people sometimes have a lot of trouble with, and if you're one of those people, the colors that I'm using to paint this red really help get a nice bright red with some deep shadows without bashing your head up against the wall to do it. The Scale 7.5 Fantasy line is pretty nice if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out. There's a bunch of kits they sell that have transitional paints in them, kind of like how Reaper does their Triad series. So it's definitely something worth looking into if you're wanting to experiment with some new colors. Now Tindalos red, when it's fully dried, ends up looking a bit more brown than red. So what I come in with next is Reaper's Master Series Clotted Red. This color, and along with most of the Reaper paints that I've used, comes out thin, and when you thin it down with your water or whatever thinning agent you use, it looks like it should barely be able to lay the color down. But over that Tindalos red, it does a really nice job of bringing the brownish red back to a little bit on the darker side red, closer to that true red color. And we're just picking out the folds and the tops of the model's shirt or tabard, just to get that base red color on the model while keeping the shadows that the Tindalos red is going to create. One of the things that you'll notice through this video is that there's quite a few mold lines still left on the model. I'm pretty sure all of them are still left on the model. With these miniatures being pre-assembled, it kind of removes me from the assembly process, and part of the thing that I do during the assembly process is remove mold lines. The color I'm working with now is Mephiston Red from GW, and this is one of their foundation paints. Again, I only really like using their foundation paints and washes, but this thing is packed with pigment. So even when you're thinning it down, you're not really fighting the color so much. You can just get the red to go down nice and smooth. And now I'm going to come back in and just reestablish some of those super bright highlights. I think the color that I had laid down before wasn't actually just Mephiston Red, it was Mephiston Red mixed with clotted red, and now I'm putting down the actual, like, straight Mephiston Red, and you can see how bright that comes off on here. And the video's been cut a bunch just to remove some of the drying time, but this is a single pass. These weren't done in multiple passes at all. Each one of these reds was just one pass with the brush to get the highlights on. So it goes by very quick. There's not a lot to this process or my process of putting down red. So if it is something you've struggled with in the past, I highly recommend those 3 paints to get you on the track to painting a nice good red. Now we're going to be revisiting the metals on this model. I'm just hitting it with straight black metal from scale 7.5, and I'm just covering most of the parts that I had painted with that black mixed with black metal base, just to start the shiny parts of metal again. Scale 7.5 metals are really great to hand brush. The paint thins really well with water, which is somewhat unique for metallic colors. It also doesn't leave behind that glittery pigment that you would see like on a Denny's booth bench or something. They're just nice and smooth, and you can actually blend them together too if you wanted to get into like 2-brush blending or just straight blending. For the ring nail, I want to avoid having to go back and wash this model, so I have wet paint on my brush, but it's not saturated with paint, and right now I'm just slightly touching the edges of the ring nail so that I can deposit the paint on the risen part of the ring nail so I don't lose the dark metal that I started this model off with. When I had said at the beginning that I was going to be doing this model quickly, the metallic is something that I really don't mind taking my time with. I think that the scale 7.5 metals look really nice when they are layered properly, so I'm not going to do the quicker version where you would take like your medium metal color, wash it, and then dry brush with a higher metal. That would get this model done a lot faster, but the transitional qualities that you get out of the scale 7.5 colors is something that I really like and want to achieve for that whole unit. It'll just look really good when they're on their tray playing the game. It looks like we're going in with the mix of heavy metal and black metal from scale 7.5. That whole set that they have for the silver metals is really fun. They're all named after metal genres. So they've got heavy metal, thrash metal, speed metal. It's just a cool naming convention they use. So I'm just going back through and doing the same thing. Brushes still wet. I'm not dry brushing the ring nail, just depositing some of that higher color on there. The last color I put on then is the straight heavy metal. And this one I'm just not putting it in a ton of places or being extremely liberal with it. I'm just getting some of those high points not being extremely mindful of how I put it on. I'm trying to make this look decent with the metals, but I'm also trying to save some time, so I'm not spending a bunch of extra brushing trying to make sure that my highlights are in the most perfect spot they could be in. You can see that the last metallic that I've put on is a little too stark, and definitely too stark for my tastes. So I'm going to go back into my palette and mix black metal and heavy metal together again. And this time I'm putting a little bit more emphasis on the heavy metal so that I can try and paint in between the heavy metal black metal mix and then the heavy metal that I just put on to try and smooth out the transition on this model. If I were to wash it, I probably could bring it back together, but I just didn't want to go through and wash the model because then I'd feel like I'd need to go and then dry brush it or something to get some of those, to reestablish some of those highlights. And when you mix your wash with flow aid, it will help it go into those recesses, but there's still going to be some left on your parts you don't want wash in, so you pretty much have to go back and get reestablish those highlights. To do the fur on this model, I've mixed P3 or Privateer Press's Menoth White base and Vallejo Game Color Leather Brown. We're going to be going for a more polar bear type fur, and I'm just doing what I can to block the color in here. I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of blending or anything like that. We're just doing some nitty-gritty fur here. One way of doing this is, again, just to put down your base coat, wash it, and then dry brush it. But I've opted to try and get the color a little bit higher and closer to white without being super bright white. So now I'm just going over the edges, or the parts that stick out with just straight Menoth white base. And I could go over and take the time with painting each individual strand of fur, but I don't like the way that I don't think that's what I'm trying to shoot for with this model. I just want to get them done. I got 11 more models after this one I have to do, so we're just trying to make it quick and easy without making it look too sloppy. I'm putting a mix of P3 Menoth White base mixed with Vallejo Game Color White. As I get to this step on the model, I realize that I've really just overcomplicated painting the fur, so I'm going to be doing some other things to the fur to make it look better. Right now it's just not quite sitting where I want it to. So when I do this over on the other models for the unit, I'll probably be just basing with the leather brown Menoth base mix, and then just trying to get it up to the pure Menoth white base so that I can dry brush and wash and be done with it. This was a little bit more involved than what I wanted, and even though I'm showing it to you, I'm more so showing you my mistakes so that you don't make them too. I just don't think that in terms of trying to get this model done quickly, that what I've ended up with on fur is really forwarding that narrative. So I'm just dry brushing with Vallejo Game Color White to pick out the details on the fur again, because as I've been highlighting them, I've kind of lost those. In an attempt to save the fur on this model, I've decided to go back in and wash it with Games Workshop Seraphim Sepia, just to get into the recesses that I might have slopped some paint over while I was trying to utilize a technique that really wasn't getting me anywhere. While the wash dries, I'm going in and just painting in the basing material that I've put on this model. I'm using a really old gritty brush so I can jam it into the crevices between all the rocks. The colors that I use for this are just some department store acrylic paints, just a brown and black. I think it's Apple Barrel from Walmart. But my basing material, I always use really cheap paint because I will have a whole army match that basing color, and I want to make sure that I'm not spending a ton of money or wasting good paints to get that to happen. Now that the wash is dried, I'm going to just pick out the details that I've tinted over with that wash with another dry brush of Vallejo Dead White. We've spent a lot of time on the cloak here just to get a look that could have been achieved a lot faster if I weren't trying to get fancy or just wasn't thinking when it came to how I was painting the cloak. The whole idea of base coat wash dry brush for fur still looks decent. I think it looks better than what I was heading towards. Now we're just going to dry brush the base with Vallejo Game Color Khaki. There's a big difference between that black and brown mix and khaki, but I am going for a lot more contrast on the base here. A lot of the area on the base is going to be covered up with snow, so having some of that contrast makes it look like the topsoil is frozen a bit. The last thing we're going to do with this model is rim the base with black. This is just something that I've typically done with all of my models, and this is the first game that I've played that has trays in them. So this rim really could have just been the same color as the rest of the ground, because it would match then the base that it's going into. But I haven't seen a whole lot of problems with rimming it in black, so I'm just going to keep doing it. This way, if I choose to display the models, they have this black frame on them. Thank you for watching. I hope this tutorial brings some new techniques to your models, and if you want to stay up to date with what Big Top Gaming is doing, we just created a Facebook page where you can post requests, questions, pictures of your own models, and just interact with us in general. You can find the link to the Facebook group in the comments below, or just search for Big Top Gaming.